Was this fake? That is the question being asked tonight. And you know what? Rightfully so. Before anyone tells you what tonight means, before the political machine spins up, before cable news decides which emotions you are supposed to feel and which questions you are supposed to suppress, let's begin somewhere much simpler with common sense. When violence, or even the credible threat of violence, erupts inside a room reportedly filled with the President of the United States, the Vice President, senior cabinet officials, and the journalists tasked with covering power itself, the American people are owed something far more valuable than immediate narrative management. They are owed clarity. You'd think that part would be obvious. And if clarity does not come quickly, if contradictions appear faster than answers, then citizens are not reckless, hateful, or conspiratorial for asking hard questions. They are doing exactly what free people are supposed to do. Imagine that. Now, let's be honest tonight. One question is already spreading across this country. Some Americans are asking whether this was simply a tragic failure or something more politically convenient. Notice what I did not say. I did not say we know it was staged. I did not say we know it was fake. But in Donald Trump's America, a political environment defined by spectacle, polarization, and a man whose entire public life has been built on controlling narratives and converting chaos into advantage, millions of Americans are going to ask questions that would have once seemed unthinkable. And frankly, they should. Questions are not conspiracy. Blind trust is. And somehow that's where we are now. This was the White House Correspondents Dinner, an event that sits at the intersection of media, power, security, symbolism, and political image. That alone is why the first layer of this story is so difficult to ignore. Because really, think about that. Reports and eyewitness accounts have raised serious questions about the absence of standard security protocols. There were no metal detectors at this event. Not one. Zero. Seriously, zero. Think about that. The president, the vice president, the entire cabinet, the first lady, all gathered in one room. Yet basic screening that ordinary citizens face at a courthouse, a concert, or even a school board meeting appears to have been missing. Americans live every day under sophisticated security theater. We are scanned, searched, and monitored constantly. So when an event of this magnitude allegedly experiences such stunning vulnerability, the natural reaction is not blind acceptance, it is disbelief. Because apparently regular PTA meetings get tighter security. After the Butler rally, even Marjorie Taylor Greene demanded answers about Secret Service failures. She wasn't declaring conspiracy, she was asking how basic protections could fail. Now, similar concerns have surfaced again. How does an armed individual get close enough in such a high-profile setting? These repeated security contradictions at politically charged moments deserve rigorous scrutiny. Any reasonable American, regardless of party, should insist on full transparency here. Not exactly an outrageous standard. And this leads us to perhaps the most uncomfortable part of the story, media hypocrisy. Oh, good, the fun part. For years, Americans have watched ordinary families bury children after school shootings, grocery store massacres, church attacks, and endless city violence. Nashville, Uvalde, Chicago weekends. Tragedy after tragedy, names briefly dominate headlines. Politicians offer carefully rehearsed condolences, and then the machine moves on. The grief remains. The spotlight fades, because somehow that's become normal. That pattern is real. And yes, people notice. So naturally, millions of people notice the contrast when fear suddenly enters elite political space. When violence touches ordinary Americans, it often becomes statistics. When violence touches institutional power, it becomes national theater. Funny how that works. This reveals America's hierarchy of tragedy. Not all suffering is framed equally. Not all fear is amplified equally. Not all victims generate equal urgency. That is not cynicism. That is observation. Uncomfortable? Sure. False? Not really. Erica Kirk left the event in tears, saying she just wanted to go home. Her distress is understandable. But the selective intensity, the way emotion surges when it touches certain circles but remains muted for everyday Americans, makes people wonder. Why does political proximity appear to determine emotional scale? That's not cruelty. That's a real question. This is where the story shifts from security to motive. The timing of this incident raises unavoidable questions. Donald Trump's poll numbers have faced pressure, criticism has been building, and suddenly violence erupts at an event filled with the journalists he has long attacked. You can see why people might raise an eyebrow. Notably, planned recognitions for difficult investigative reporting, including work tied to sensitive files, were quietly overshadowed. The focus has already shifted. Within hours, we are being presented with a new, dominant narrative. Donald Trump, the survivor, the fighter who cannot be stopped. The dinner will be rescheduled, but the original purpose now appears secondary to this story of resilience. Because of course it does. Critics will inevitably ask how this may be politically leveraged. Who benefits? What uncomfortable stories disappeared that night? What new demands for unity and loyalty are being made? Again, not conclusions, questions. In Washington, crisis doesn't always create power. Sometimes power recognizes crisis and knows exactly how to use it. Not certainty, not accusation, just questions. And apparently questions are dangerous now. There is also an extraordinary irony here. This was supposed to be a night honoring journalism, truth-seeking, and institutional accountability. Instead, the evening became overshadowed by chaos, fear, and security questions. The night journalism was meant to be celebrated became a night where journalism itself requires the most intense scrutiny. You really cannot script irony better than that. History warns us that moments of fear and violence have often been used to reshape narratives. After 9/11, a unified nation accepted major expansions of government power. The Gulf of Tonkin incident led to deeper involvement based on contested claims. These are documented patterns. I am not equating events in scale, but the mechanism is familiar. A shocking incident, public alarm, then swift calls for stronger leadership and fewer questions. Because history has a few sequels. Donald Trump has spent years labeling the press as the enemy of the people. The irony is profound when violence strikes their gathering and the story quickly turns toward his strength rather than the institutional failures that allowed it. Regardless of party, when political violence intersects with power, scrutiny must intensify. That should not be controversial. Tonight, Donald Trump is already holding press conferences. The heroic storyline is being constructed in real time. The mainstream press offers somber statements. This is a sad night for America, yes, but let's talk about that. The truly sad nights are the ones where dozens of ordinary Americans die from gun violence and Washington barely pauses. Those deaths become mere statistics. This incident will dominate headlines for weeks. Because apparently whose fear matters most is still a ratings decision. Political violence is rising because the temperature in this country has been raised for years. Language from the top has consequences. When those consequences appear to serve the man in power, reasonable citizens, regardless of party, have every right to examine them with clear eyes. That's called citizenship. Some Americans are asking whether this was simply failure or something more politically convenient. I am not declaring what happened. Investigations must proceed. But ignoring the reported security concerns, the timing, the overshadowed journalism recognitions, and the selective national mourning would be irresponsible and, frankly, a little absurd. Here's the deeper national problem and perhaps the most devastating one. Millions of Americans no longer instinctively trust official simplicity, and that alone should terrify every institution in this country. Because, wow, that is a big deal. Because when trust erodes this far, every crisis becomes two crises. First, the event itself. Second, the collapse of public confidence surrounding it. That is not healthy. That is not sustainable. And no, that's not hyperbole. The real scandal here may be larger than one dinner, one shooting, or one news cycle. It may be that millions of Americans now feel they must independently audit reality every time power, media, and fear collide. That level of distrust was earned through inconsistency, selective outrage, media double standards, and too many moments where public emotion felt managed rather than informed. People don't just invent that overnight. So no questioning power is not radical. Questioning political convenience is not dangerous. Questioning contradictions is not unpatriotic. It's supposed to be the job. In fact, in a constitutional republic, that may be the last defense patriotism has left, which maybe we should remember. Whether this was catastrophic incompetence, politically convenient timing, narrative exploitation, simple chaos, or something else entirely, Americans should never apologize for asking hard questions when the stakes are this high. They should never be shamed for noticing inconsistencies. They should never be bullied into emotional conformity before facts are fully understood. That would be insane, because real democracy does not ask citizens to protect power from scrutiny. It demands that power survive scrutiny from citizens. Big difference. And tonight, perhaps more than anything else, that is the real test. Not whether people feel fear, not whether people feel outrage, but whether people still feel entitled to think critically while fear is unfolding. That's the whole game. Maybe this was exactly what we are being told. Maybe. But in modern America, where trust has been stretched thin and narratives are often built at the speed of political necessity, the deeper tragedy may be this. Too many citizens no longer know when they are witnessing truth, when they are witnessing failure, and when they are witnessing something being used. And honestly, that should scare everyone. That uncertainty is corrosive. It really is. Until institutions earn back our trust, keep asking questions, stay skeptical, reject easy narratives, and remember, in free societies, questions are not the threat. The threat is when citizens are taught to stop asking them. That's when things really go sideways. Thank you for sitting with these difficult thoughts. Your instincts tonight were valid. Seriously. I'll see you in the next one.